In this video, we will be replacing the driver's side valve cover gasket in this 2012 Ford F150. Taking a look inside the engine bay, we will start by removing our engine appearance cover. To do this, we can remove the oil fill location cap, pull that cover off, and then replace that cap. We then want to remove our air cleaner outlet pipe. This is our Y pipe that splits off to each side of the engine, and that is held on by 3 worm clamps. We can remove that piece of insulation. One of the items we will be removing is the fuel injection pump, and before we remove this, we do want to relieve the fuel pressure. And up underneath the bed, above the spare tire, we have the fuel pump control module. This is located towards the front of the spare tire on top of it. Taking a look around the spare tire, we can see our wiring harness. And as we continue to go around that spare tire, we do see that wiring harness connection point for our module. And on the top of the wiring harness, we do have a small tab that we need to depress. This will allow us to wiggle that wiring harness off. We then want to start the engine and let it idle until it dies. Once it dies, we're going to turn over the engine for an additional 5 seconds. Following our fuel line, we do have 2 8mm fasteners. We can then put a rag underneath that hard line going to our pump. And before starting to work on the pump, we do want to disconnect the negative battery terminal and set that out of the way. And to remove the hard line, we are using a 17mm tubing wrench. This is a flared fitting on this fuel line, and so we can work that loose and then pull that off. There will be some residual fuel that leaks out, which is why we have that rag there. We do want to make note of our electrical connector. The tab is on the bottom, so we will wait until we pull the pump out to get better access. So we will focus on our quick release next. And these particular quick release clips are not super quick. Perhaps if I have done a bunch of these before, I'd be a little bit quicker. This did take me about 5 minutes to work those tabs through. I was attempting to be very careful so that I did not break the clips or the legs of the clips off, but it will slide out a fair amount. It won't slide all the way out. It will release from that fuel line, and then that will allow us to wiggle the entire connector off of that fuel line. And much like the other line, there will be some residual fuel. If we take a look at the pump, we have a 10mm fastener on each side. We want to slowly release this, so we're going to be working back and forth between bolts. And we can then work on releasing that wiring harness. We can then disconnect the wiring harness for our ignition coils and remove that fastener. It is an 8mm. And I did see some debris, so I am going to blow this off again with some compressed air before I remove those. And then we can pull those out. And to get my frontmost coil out, I do need to remove that ventilation tube. And there's a little tab to slide to the side. And when I did remove that, I did have this little piece break off, but upon further inspection, it is actually just glued on So we'll have to do some cleanup and re-glue this. And we can then work on the rest of those coils. And I will add a rag into those holes to help prevent debris from falling down there. We can then remove our VCT sensor harness. We have a little tab that needs to be slid upward, and then we can work that off. And we will want to remove the dipstick as well. At this point, we basically want to work our way around the perimeter of the valve cover. Any point which it is zip tied down to one of the fasteners, or if there is some other component that is in our way, tubes or vacuum hoses or whatnot, we want to move these out of the way as best as we can. And we do have a handful of these wiring harnesses that are held down by these small caps. We can cut those, pull out our tails, trim off the excess, and add new tails. At this point, we have basically removed everything from the perimeter of the valve cover. Our goal now is to loosen the valve cover bolts that go around that perimeter. These bolts do not come all the way out, they just loosen up and spin. And to reduce problems, I will be applying some Amsoil metal protector to each of these fastener locations. These are 10mm fasteners. And I am going to jump around a little bit as I loosen them. And the hardest part of this job is actually getting the valve cover off. I do not typically recommend people ever using metal pry bars on these type of mating surfaces. However, that was really the only way I was able to get this pried loose, was to put a tremendous amount of force on that to get that to pop off. And we can do a quick inspection of the inside there. Now this was very difficult to remove. It did probably take an hour or so. Part of the problem was the VCT solenoids will stick in the boots. Additionally, our 3 spark plug locations will stick in those as well. And that's not to mention that the gasket going around the perimeter will also stick. And so we will start prepping this with using Amsoil engine degreaser to clean this up a little bit. And while that valve cover is sitting, we will use some acetone to clean up our mating surface. And I do want to make note of our 2 locations where the timing chain cover mounts to the rest of the engine. These will need some sealant. After we've got that cleaned up, I'm going to be using a 15/16 socket to work out our VCT gasket. And I am going to wedge a towel up underneath it and have this sit on the towel to take some of the shock. And we want to clean that location. And we can install our new seals. And I did jump up to a 1-inch socket for that one. And our spark plug locations can come next. I am using a 1 1/4 inch socket for this. And a little bit of cleanup. And we can then go through the process of reinstalling our new gaskets for our spark plug locations. Next we have the gasket for our pump. This is a T30. Now it is worth noting we have a small tab on the gasket that does correlate to a small notched out portion on our valve cover. And we do want to do a bit of cleanup with some acetone. And I am going to clean that groove with a shop towel and then work that new gasket in place. And then I have 2 small O-rings to replace. And that can then be reinstalled. We can then remove our old gasket and work our new gasket in place. Now that we are ready to reinstall everything, we are going to apply a little bit of sealant on the 2 locations where there is a seam between the engine and the timing chain cover. And we can start our process to work that valve cover back in place. We do want to be a little bit careful that we do not dislodge that new gasket we put on. And right before setting that on, I am going to put a little bit of oil around those new seals so they slide on a little easier. And as we work this into place, we do want to make sure none of our wiring harnesses are caught underneath the valve cover. And then we want to start each of those bolts by hand. These are 10mm fasteners. And with those bolts hand tight, we can come back and torque them in sequence to 89 inch-pounds. And following that torque sequence will ensure we apply even pressure as we install this. And it is worth noting that the VCT sensors should have the boot sitting just slightly below the top edge of that sensor. If everything went together well, it should slide down just a little bit. And we are at the point where we can start connecting everything back together. I will work my way around the perimeter and make sure that each of the various components get reattached to the corresponding bolt. I had taken some pictures beforehand just to make sure that I get everything reconnected. This includes those VCT sensors. We do have a lighter colored one and a darker colored one. Because the pump is actuated by the camshaft, we do need to turn the engine over using a 18mm socket on a ratchet. I can rotate the crankshaft pulley in a clockwise direction to turn that engine over and get that moving. And if I speed up the footage, we can clearly see that moving. This will give us a little extra space for installing that pump. And a couple more items before we install that pump. We'll go ahead and reinstall that dipstick. Followed by our coils. And those get torqued to 62 inch-pounds with an 8mm socket. And then our connectors. And we got that PCV tube. And we can install our pump. And these will be torqued to 89 inch-pounds plus 45 degrees, and we are going to alternate back and forth as we do this. So we got our 89 inch-pounds. Now we're going to go 45 degrees. Then we have our fuel lines and our electrical connector. And we can't forget about those fasteners on that fuel hard line. And then we have our insulation. And before I install that Y pipe for my air system, I am going to do one last visual inspection just to make sure everything is hooked up and I have no loose lines anywhere. And we can hook up our battery. And don't forget that module up above the spare tire. And then we have our engine cover. Now I am going to let this sit for 24 hours since I did use sealant in those 2 locations. This will give that time to fully cure. And this repair is complete.